Hello and welcome to another episode of The Living Philosophy. Today we are going to talk about an ancient Greek pre-Socratic philosopher. It's a guy called Anaxagoras. Really interesting guy, and I guess the big idea, the one he'd be known for, is the idea of the nous, and nous means mind or intellect, and his philosophy was that nous was the fundamental element, was the element that set everything in motion and is the all-knowing interconnected thing. So it's a sort of a panpsychism that goes on with him. Well, no, panpsychism is wrong actually, because mind is distinguished. It's more that mind is the kingpin of everything. So yeah, he's a really interesting guy, so we're going to dig into him, look a little bit in his background, a little bit of his philosophy before we dig into the real cosmogonical creation myth that he kind of had and where he saw that fitting in. And then towards the end we're going to look at how that gels with Parmenides, who was probably the greatest philosopher before Plato anyway, before Plato and Socrates, and just a towering intellectual giant who philosophers are still wrestling with today. So Anaxagoras would have been just after Parmenides, and he would have been wrestling with the legacy of Parmenides. So we're going to see how his philosophy fits in with that. Now, this is a continuation of our series on the Presocratics. Previously had an episode on Heraclitus of Ephesus, and yeah, so you can check out the episode on that. And kind of, I think there'll be future episodes be looking at Parmenides, but he's a tough one to dig into because it's very complex and there's so much that's in debate with him. But anyway, today we're going to talk about Anaxagoras, who is a very interesting philosopher, as I've mentioned. And it's not just from a philosophical point of view that is interesting, but also the time that Anaxagoras lived was such a transformational time in ancient Greece. So we're looking at, he was born around 500 BC in a place called Clazomenae, which was an Ionian island. So it would have been a Greek colony off the coast of Asia Minor in modern day Turkey. And at the time that Anaxagoras was born, it was actually controlled by Persia. And in his early life then would have been 480 BC, 478 BC, when Persia invaded Athens, and we had those great scenes of Leonidas and the 300 and the tiny Athenians pushing back the mighty empire of Persia. And it's actually, some people have suggested that maybe Anaxagoras was on the other side. Maybe he was fighting for the Persians, since the Persians controlled Clazomenae at that time. So it's quite possible that he fought against the Greeks. He's also momentous historically because he was the first philosopher to live in Athens, first major philosopher that we have that actually lived in Athens. So Heraclitus was in Ephesus, over also off the coast of Asia Minor. So was Thales, Miletus is over around there as well, and Parmenides is in the west over on the south of Italy. So it's the first philosopher to come and live in Athens, which is really obviously quite momentous, seeing how things progress from there. And he's probably, I think Parmenides is said to have been around 520 BC and he's around 500 BC. So he's younger than Parmenides, but not that much younger. And so there's the dialogue by Plato called Parmenides, so where Parmenides and his student Zeno come to Athens. So Anaxagoras might have been there around that time, and Socrates would have been a young man while Anaxagoras was living and being a philosopher in ancient Athens. So there was a lot happening at this time in Athens, and it's kind of the birth of that kind of the philosophical tradition that blossomed, fully came into its full fruition with Plato, and then the Aristotle, and then the Stoics and Epicureans kind of came later. So really interesting time in history, because it's not just philosophical, intellectually interesting, but you've also got all this backdrop of political and historical upheaval. So you got Persia invading Greece, and then the Athenian Empire founding, and kind of the tensions with Sparta then. And you would have seen Anaxagoras he's said to have been either a protege or a teacher or a friend of Heraclitus, so the great Athenian statesman who we can still see the remnants of today. So if you go to Athens, you go look up at the Acropolis, that hill in the center of Athens, and you see the Parthenon, the remnants of the mighty Parthenon. Well, that was a series of building works that Heraclitus undertook. And I think he built most of the structures up on top of the Acropolis. So really, this is the time of Athens and the Athenian Empire kind of coming into its fruition. This is where Anaxagoras is kind of right in the middle of it, wrestling with the great ideas of the Greek philosophical tradition kind of coming into its fullness, and also the Greek political situation kind of coming into full ripeness as well. So he was very close to Heraclitus, and it's said that later on in his life he was exiled from Athens for impiety, same thing that Socrates was convicted for in the Apology, and for which he had to take the old hemlock and die, unfortunately. And so exiled for impiety, it looks like it was more probably political reasons rather than actual upstanding religious reasons. So probably his connection with Pericles, who was maybe falling out of favour at the time. And so he was exiled to Lampsacus, I think was the name of the place he was exiled to, where he was, I think, over by the Hellespont, where Constantinople would be, kind of around that area today, or Istanbul as it is called today. And he was held in high regard there for the last couple of decades of his life, and after his death he was kind of well looked after over there. So he was highly praised and highly adored. So that was the life of Anaxagoras. Probably died around maybe 430. I wouldn't be sure about the date. I'm not sure the historians are sure about the dates either. But around that, we're looking at probably around a 70-year lifespan there. So, really interesting guy, coming at a really interesting time in history, and he's got a philosophy to match it. Now, he wouldn't be someone that really jumps out in history, his name. You kind of hear, before of the Presocratics, you hear Democritus is famous for coming up with atomism, and then you've got the Heraclitus and Parmenides duo and their fascinating, groundbreaking kind of insights. Thales as being the first, so Anaxagoras kind of just slips through the cracks a little bit there, and I guess the only thing really that makes him jump out is this idea of nous and where it fits in with his philosophy. But he's a really interesting thinker, and well worth exploring, so hence why we're here today. So let's have a little look at some of the things that he thought. So I guess first of all, what he contributed scientifically. So he was, like, as with Thales was famous as the first philosopher, but he predicted an eclipse in his time, and he was kind of, that wowed the people of the days that he could predict that. And Anaxagoras apparently predicted a meteorite falling from the sky, and he also was the first to kind of figure out that the moon, the light of the moon was actually just a reflection of the sun. So that's pretty interesting. And then he also figured out that rainbows was an interplay between clouds and light, and the light of the sun. So really kind of he was a more empirical, observational kind of, you can see the beginnings of that scientific thinking coming along with him. So that's really cool. And then if you look over to the more typical pre-Socratic kind of stuff that he has with the kind of cosmogonical, overarching philosophy of creation. So this is really interesting. It's kind of, you see the bridge in the pre-Socratics between religion and philosophy, between religion and science as well. Philosophy is kind of that middle ground treading between them. And so at the very beginning of Anaxagoras' work, he was another one of those philosophers that wrote one book in his life. So we have also the Parmenides and Heraclitus would have been another two big ones that just wrote this monster work that was just amazing in their time. So that's where Anaxagoras kind of comes in, and his book starts with the beginning of the universe. And he says that everything is in this kind of this state of undifferentiatedness, and here's what he has to say about the beginning of all things. So he says that all things were together, unlimited both in amount and in smallness, for the small too was unlimited, and because all things were together, nothing was evident on account of smallness. So again, you can see there's some technical stuff in there where you see that it's a kind of an initial state in which everything is kind of together, everything is kind of one. And smallness is one of the elements, one of the seeds. So in Anaxagoras' philosophy, there's all these seeds which are these traits. So you've got dampness, you've got heat, you've got brightness, you've got heaviness, So these are like the old pairs of the opposites that go together. And so he's got all these kind of going on, and they're all there at the very beginning of all time, and they're all kind of mixed into a pile together. And what's interesting is that he says that all of these can interpenetrate. So they're not like solid balls that bounce off each other. They're elements which can mix together like water, like a solution of salt and water, or sugar and water. So these things can all kind of mix together. So an area can have all these different traits mixed in. So you can have heat and brightness over here. You can have coldness and dampness over here, and depending on whether there's more individual atoms of like coldness or of dampness or of heat or whatever, that's the traits that area seems to have, or smallness or bigness, as he's kind of talking about there. So these seeds are very important in Anaxagoras, and this is the fundamental thing of which the universe is made. So it's all these, and they're unlimited. So it's this vastness of unlimited space. And at the beginning of time, everything is in that field of undifferentiatedness. So they're all together, they're all mixed, but mixed evenly. And there's one element that's different to all these elements. So these elements can interpenetrate, and when they meet each other, they'll just dissolve into each other. But there's one trait that is separate. There's one trait which is aside from all these. And that is, of course, nous, for which Anaxagoras is famous for. So let's listen to a couple of things about what he has to say about nous. He says that in everything there is a share of everything except nous, but there are some things in which nous too is present. The other things have a share of everything, but nous is unlimited and self-ruling, and has been mixed with no thing, but is alone itself by itself. So, yeah, you can see already that there's something different about nous there, and if kind of to jump forward in the history of philosophy to think of how this is different from Descartes is really interesting. So, with Descartes, we see that the mind-body problem kind of becomes prominent, and the mind is separated from the body, and we develop this realization that, well, how can mind act on will? If mind is something completely different qualitatively from body, from matter, then how can it act on it? How can it have an effect which crosses that boundary? If it's something completely other, then they should just pass each other by. They should just be operating in completely different spheres. So how can the mind connect to the body? Whereas we see here with Anaxagoras, it's a completely different attitude. So all of the matter, all of these individual little elements, they mix together, they interpenetrate, so they dissolve into each other, and so there's no movement there because they just kind of freely join. And so it's the separateness of nous, it's the separateness of mind which can actually cause movement, because it bounces off them, it's separate to them and causes movement. And so what happens is you've got this initial state of the universe where everything is just spread out, everything is kind of undifferentiated. And nous comes along when the time is right, and it begins to set everything in motion, and it's a great revolution, a great rotation of all this matter of the universe, and it starts to stir it all in a bigger and bigger loop and a bigger and bigger section. And what happens is all these different seeds, all these different qualities and traits start to get mixed up in different ratios, and that is how you get the nature of the universe. So you get the more chemicals of heat and brightness coming over here, and more of darkness and dampness over here, and so you get these different clumps of things mixing together, and that's how you get this universe around us. These are just the different displacement of these traits by nous. And there's more to nous than just that, so there's this all-knowing aspect of nous. So let's see what Anaxagoras has to say about that. It is the finest of all things and the purest, and indeed it maintains all discernment about everything and has the greatest strength. And nous controlled the whole revolution, so that it started to revolve in the beginning. First it began to revolve from a small region, but it is revolving yet more, and it will revolve still more. And nous knew them all, the things that are being mixed together, the things that are being separated off, and the things that are being dissociated. And whatever sorts of things were going to be, and whatever sorts of things were, and now are not, and as many as are now and whatever sorts will be, all these Nous set in order. And Nous also ordered this revolution, in which the things being separated off now revolve, the stars and the sun and the moon and the air and the ether. So you see there that Nous has this kind of there's a knowingness there. It's got discernment. It's not just an unintelligent principle. It is intelligence itself. There is some sort of a knowledge in what it is doing. And this is like a cosmic Nous that we're looking at here. And this is omnipresent throughout the universe. And it's this also in these, it seems to be its own set of seeds and elements, and it's moving these things all around together. So it's not like the separateness of mind in the Cartesian dualism. And it's the same thing. So these particles of Nous. So he has this to say: in everything there is a share of everything except Nous, but there are some things in which Nous too is present. And so what he's talking about here is that Nous is soul, is intelligence, and that's what we're imbued with. So we are also imbibing and fueled by that Nous. So we have those particles of Nous, and hence we have soul, we have intelligence. And I guess there's more of it in humans, and you also see it in animals. And Anaxagoras was also really interesting because he saw it in plants. He believed that plants were animals, that they reacted and felt their own pleasure or pain. So he believed that was going on in animals as well. So I guess Nous was something that was permeating through a lot of the universe, which is a really kind of novel, almost a spiritual thing, to see that mind as a fundamental element rather than as an emergent principle of matter. It is the thing which sets matter in motion. So it's truly mind over matter in this sense. And it reminds me of the logos in the Bible and Heraclitus, this animating principle which sets everything in motion, or the Tao of Lao Tzu and Chuang Tzu and Taoism. It's this living force, the way. So it's this really interesting principle is Nous, and central to Anaxagoras' philosophy. And it's worth looking into a few nuances of what Anaxagoras is talking about here. So there's a bit of debate over what the seeds are. So I've kind of kept it simple by saying that they're brightness and darkness and dampness and dryness and heaviness and lightness. So I've kind of put it in those terms, but there's actually 3 different camps about what counts as a seed, as an element. And one camp says that it is just these things, it is just these pairs of opposites and these kind of elemental, objective-y kind of opposites, these traits. But there's another school which says, and I guess this is kind of picking up on something Aristotle said while mixing it a little bit, because he says that all things are Nous. So all things are these seeds. And so this second camp would say that everything is an element. So you've got these little homunculi, you've got these humanness is a trait, just as dryness is a trait. And so when you get enough of these humanness qualities in one place, you get a human. And that's obviously an extreme view. I guess you can see something of like Plato's Platonic forms and ideas in there, that there's always an idea, a correlative thing, and there's a correlative seed for everything that there is. So this table is made up of lots of table elements. The camera is made up of a lot of camera elements. So yeah, I mean, it's that one seems a little bit absurd. But the third camp then is kind of between the two of them, because what Aristotle said is that he talks about, brightness, dampness and those, but he also mentions flesh, bones and blood and other such things. And I guess that's where we got a bit confused, and that kind of throws a spanner in the works, because you think, flesh, blood and bones, they don't strike you as fundamental elements. They would seem to be natural constructions. But it seems that for Anaxagoras, at least as far as Aristotle or Theophrastus are telling us, is these are fundamental traits. So you've got blood traits and bones traits and flesh traits out there, I guess. But the line of where those natural elements begin and end is kind of a bit vague. But then you've got the combinations. So these come into natural construction, so that the sun and the ether kind of come together. And this is another reason why that second camp, where everything is like that, seems to be a bit off, because if you listen to one of Anaxagoras' quotes, it kind of points the other way and suggests that the sun and the ether are natural constructions rather than fundamental elements. So that's one nuance. I think another thing for understanding what Anaxagoras is actually doing here. So why is he kind of constructed these little elements, and what is he actually doing? And I guess for that you got to look to Parmenides, who would have been, as we've seen just recently, before Anaxagoras, but would have completely turned all previous philosophy on its head with his creation. So Parmenides had this book, and this book had two parts. The first was the Aletheia, which is the way of truth, and the second was the Doxa, which is the way of opinion, the way of morals. And the way of truth is this monumental work, which is really just quite mind-blowing and quite staggering, and that's the part that we're still wrestling with today. It's the part he kind of proves that truth, the things in reality have to be this oneness, this almost this atom of impenetrability and unchangingness and eternality. So it's this unchanging eternal element. And the traditional reading has kind of been that this is a monist point of view, that there's just one thing, and that one thing is the unchanging thing. But there's another view that it's a pluralistic thing, so that the nature of reality can be that there are many of these things, but these things have to be unchanging. Being itself is unchanging and eternal. And so that's kind of the background against which Anaxagoras is coming, is this unchangingness. And the second half of Parmenides' book then is the Doxa, is the way of opinion, the way of mortal thought. And this is the goddess is then communicating to Parmenides in his book that this has no real stock. Don't put any stock in this, because humans are deceived, that they're kind of living in these illusions. And yet she then goes on to chart the nature of the world and the ways things work. And he gets into all these kind of the early nascent scientific things, which we would now call pseudoscientific if someone was coming out with them. The kind of things like Aristotle had with frogs being born from the mud kind of thing. So it's just kind of weird that Parmenides has this whole other section, and we don't really have the bridge between them. We have little snippets from the Doxa, but we've got a lot of the Aletheia, because the Aletheia was obviously the real potent thing. But then why did he go on to map out, to chart the Doxa, if it's got no real, bearing, if it's got no significance or any weight because of what the Aletheia has said, the way of truth has said? So that's kind of a confusing thing of how do you reconcile the ever-changingness of the world, the appearance and the illusory aspects of the world, with this unchanging eternality. So it's that meeting between a kind of a religion, spiritual thing, mystical, religious, spiritual thing, with this kind of scientific, practical mind. And that's so characteristic of the Presocratics as a whole. And you also see this in Heraclitus. One of the first sayings in Heraclitus' book is, "It is wise agreeing with me. It is wise not agreeing with me, but with the Logos, that all things are one." And he's kind of got this oneness, this unchanging, eternal oneness that is the Logos, which means word or reason. And this kind of the word, anything ology is derived from Logos. And on the other hand, what Heraclitus is most famous for is Pantarei, the all-changingness, the eternal changingness of things. And that's a really interesting kind of juxtaposition there as well, where he's got this one unchanging things, and yet he's most famous for the constant change. So you might have heard Heraclitus saying that you can't step into the same river twice, because more and more waters flow over it. So the river is constantly changing. So Anaxagoras is kind of inheriting this Greek tradition of philosophy, of this juxtaposition between unchanging world and a changing world. And his attitude then is a really interesting one. It's a really cool way of reconciling those opposites. So you've got that unchanging elements. This is where the seeds come in. These are Parmenides' unchanging, eternal bits of reality that do not change. The change happens, so they're all mixed in together, and there's no change. They are eternal, but it's news that comes along, mind comes along and mixes them around, and because the ratios change and create this dance of light that is reality, that is this kind of simulation of appearances. Well, that's the appearance of change caused by news moving around these fundamental unchanging aspects of reality. So it appears that there's change when really it's just the unchanging things moving about. Now you'd wonder, is that movingness, is that change, is that not change? But anyway, that seems to be his reconciliation between Parmenides' eternal unchanging atoms and atoms of being and truth and reality, and the appearance, the doxa. So why is all this illusory change seeming to be happening? And it's in its own way, it's a genius kind of combination there. And that's kind of seems to be where he's coming from, where Anaxagoras is coming from in creating this philosophy of his. So yeah, I guess that's just about everything that I wanted to cover. That interesting connection between him and Parmenides, and that fascinating philosophical conception of mind as the master material, as the master element, and even just Anaxagoras' a really interesting biographical time period. So I hope you've enjoyed this. If you have, please subscribe, give us a thumbs up down below. And yeah, if you have any comments or insights, or if I missed anything interesting there, please comment down below, and I shall see you next time. Thank you for watching.